Welcome to Spotlight at Northern. I'm Ken Blanchard, professor of government, philosophy, and basket weaving here at Northern State University. My colleague Dr. Schaaf, co-creator of Spotlight at Northern, couldn't be here today because he's not feeling very well. He's got little kids and he's therefore a charter member of the Disease of the Month Club. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I'm also the creator of Wolf Tracks podcast, and there's a lot of other interesting things on there. So if you simply Google Wolf Tracks at Northern, you will find the podcast and be able to listen to it. My guests today are professors of history. Art Marmerstein, I go by seniority here, and Stephen Usitalo. And they've joined to talk about the Gaza war, both in its more specific aspects and perhaps, depending on how much time we have, a more general background about the nation of Israel. So, welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ken.
Let me just start with a question that I think is legitimate, because one of my students who's from Africa came up to me shortly after October 7th, and I've been talking about it a little bit. And I had described my understanding of what had happened on that day, and she told me that, well, this is not what I'm hearing on TikTok, which was not entirely surprising. Do we know what happened on October 7th, and if so, what was it? Stephen, I'll let you.
Well, you know what I think happened, this is sort of in the next 6 months to a year, they're going to do intelligence reports that'll sort of try to go back in time a little bit. Initially, we thought that Hamas probably had been training for 1.5 to 2 years, although any ideas of how long Hamas is training, you have to understand, has to be filtered through the idea that Israeli intelligence, of course, wants us to think that they've been training for multiple years in order to explain their own failures, in order to pick up the Hamas attack. But what did happen was Hamas on October 7th launched an attack, a ground attack across they broke through the fencing, the barriers that were apparently not as well defended as the Israelis thought they were, through paragliders as well. And they apparently had, if we accept the idea that they've been planning this for 1.5 years, they probably received some outside training for it. Hezbollah probably did not know about it, which is the organization in Lebanon that is probably a greater threat to Israel. Iran probably did, but they didn't give the green light probably on the day of the attack or when it would occur. But they did train Hamas, and they killed roughly, what is the numbers now, about 1,100 to 1,200 Israelis.
Somewhere around 1,200 is true.
1,200 Israelis, probably nearly a quarter of them military. And then they seized hostages. We don't know quite the number, probably around 150, although they occasionally still announce deaths. And so the Hamas attack was on October 7th. It caught Israel by surprise. And that's not, the initial attack is not just the surprise. The surprise was how long it took the Israeli Defense Forces to react to the attack, which was several hours to this. And the response has been an Israeli attack on Gaza, the Gaza Strip, where Hamas is based. And they've been the political force there for 17 years. There's no real elections in Gaza, but they've controlled that strip. And so it was a terrorist attack, or if you see Hamas as a state organization, it was a attack on Israel by another state. It depends on how you define these types of things. And Israel is responding now with an attack on Hamas. And that's where we are now. And the Israeli side is really too early to tell what's going to happen in the next several months. We don't really know what Israeli goals are. We don't really know what Hamas intended to do. I was listening to Michael Vickers and these other CIA analysts the other day, and they gave probably the best bet argument, which is, what if Hamas is a classic group? Did they launch this attack out of desperation, meaning that Israel was engaging in improve diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates. And it's been going on for quite a few years, not just the last 2 to 3. So economic relations were good with other countries. And Hamas was increasingly marginalized, and they couldn't launch the old attacks that they had because of the seemingly impregnable defenses that Israel. So the argument would be that they launched this attack hoping that Israel would overreact, which is going back to the Serbian attack of 1914, where the Black Hand killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, hoping the Austrians would overreact and they'd get a war out of it and everything would go to hell, which is exactly what happened. What Osama
Sometimes
bin
it works.
Laden did in 2001, which is attack the U.S., hoping the U.S. would overreact. And what they're doing now, which is hoping that Israel will overreact and destroy any hope for accords between Israel and surrounding states. That's what I think where we're at.
That's a fairly good summary. Do you have anything to add to that, Art?
I think that that's pretty close, although I would think, my guess is that Iran is playing a bigger role in that. You think that Iran is on the sidelines. I really think that, I have no evidence for this other than I think that it's Iran that really does not want any kind of accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states. And so, again, just a guess. Also, you mentioned the fact that Israel gets caught off guard, and that is quite true, that this was a major failure of Israeli intelligence, which is supposed to be the best in the world, and didn't spot this attack. Now, part of the excuse for that was, well, this is right after the High Holy Days. There had been an attack on Israel, of course, in 1973, right on Yom Kippur. Well, this isn't Yom Kippur again, but just let down a little bit, and we've got Simchat Torah, the rejoicing over the law, the happiest day on the Jewish calendar, and that's what's being celebrated. One of the things that strikes me is kind of ironic is that there is a song associated with that time. Just a little earlier, a week or so earlier, during the High Holy Days, they would have been singing the song Hashanah Haba'ah, and the words in English are, in the next year, you'll see how good it will be. All these wonderful things happening. Very popular song in Israel, particularly at New Year's time. How good it's going to be, and what an irony of the horrible things that are happening just after the time that they're, and I think it was actually a well-timed attack because it's time to let down a little bit. You attack the United States at Christmas time, and we're going to be off guard a little bit. So Israel got caught off guard. There are a lot of people embarrassed by that. I think Israel also, from what I understand, there is a very strong anti-gun movement in Israel as well, and the kibbutzes, which used to be well armed, were not nearly as well prepared to defend themselves as they might have been. So that's going to embarrass some people as well. But there is that major sense of failure on the part of Israel. And I think you're right too. Is that from the Hamas point of view, but then I think Israel is caught between. They really are caught. I read an article yesterday. It's from the Israeli point of view, it's an almost insoluble situation, and this has been true of terrorism for a long time. Long before 9/11, people were saying that the problem with the Islamic world in its hatred of the United States is there are two conflicting views. On the one, the United States is a big bully. They're mean and they're nasty and they're Satan, and you have to hate them. On the other hand, America is a bunch of cowards, and if you stand up to them, they'll back down. And no matter what you do as the United States, it plays into one of those images. If you are soft in your reaction, then you're a coward and we can win. If the United States is aggressive, see, they're bullies. And Israel is caught in exactly that situation. If they're mild in their response, we're going to beat them. We're just going to stand up and we're going to stand longer. And unfortunately, historically, terrorist groups, if they can last long enough, they get their way. The terrorists get their way in Ireland and many other places. So, and you point out, Black Hand gets what it wants. So
it's hard not to respond. But one of these ironies, when Art points out, is the kibbutzes in the south. These are not the West Bank settlers. These are different types of Israelis who are living in those areas. And many of the people at the music festival would have been almost stereotypically pro-peace.
Oh yes,
these people, and they're the ones who paid the price.
That's of course that's often the case, that the people who are most moderate. Yeah, I would you said a lot of things I think are worth thinking about. One is that the Israelis are going to say that it was years in the planning. That's what I would do if I was part of the intelligence service that was supposed to catch this. I'm guessing if it had been years in the planning, the Israelis would have found out about it. It succeeded probably because it was fairly quick. I agree with Art. I think this was basically an Iranian operation carried out through proxies. And the problem, as you suggested, is that Israel is establishing ties with a lot of these different countries. And the power that stands to lose most is Iran. But I want to but before we go on, I want to, be clear about what actually happened. You mentioned the music festival. This was a bunch of people coming together to listen to music, and an enormous number of people there were slaughtered. Some taken prisoner. Women were raped and killed in many cases, sometimes beheading. Almost certainly a lot of children were murdered. Some people were murdered in their beds. And I, how do I know all this happened? New York Times is no friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. It's not pro-Israel for any reasonable purpose. They went in and they examined all the intelligence the Israelis provided them, and they confirmed the basic Israeli account of the attack. It was primarily an attack on civilians. Whether it's a state, whether you consider Hamas a state or not, is almost irrelevant, because if it's a state, it's a war crime in sort of the highest level. If it's terrorism, well, it's terrorism. Although I note that the BBC has never been able to bring itself to call it terrorism. I don't think the Washington Post has. The New York Times didn't at first and then turned around and started to do so. But what we're looking at here is an atrocity by any reasonable standards. And there's no doubt that that's what happened. Now the question is, what could Israel do after such an event? What should it have done after such an event? Because obviously the talk now is that it's Israel that's committing genocide, which seems to me fairly ridiculous. But they're no doubt killing a lot of people. And New York Times, which every time it says Trump said something, they always tell you it's a lie. Every time Hamas says something, they simply report it. Yeah. And it does seem to me there's interesting thing going on there. What were Israel's options? What should it have done?
That's the problem. Is Israel's in a terrible situation where they're stuck in this geopolitical situation where the West Bank, which is 25% of the size of Israel, they're barely holding on to the West Bank. They have a major military force, the largest militia in the world, Hezbollah, on the Lebanese border, which it's been somewhat conservative of late because they don't want to engage in a full conflict. So they have the West Bank, they have Lebanon to the north, which is unstable. They have the Gaza Strip. They have Golan. They have Syria, which is unstable and potentially problematic. So they have this situation where, do you pursue a one-state solution? Do you pursue a two-state solution? How do you create a second? Because a two-state solution will not work unless the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are independent, and that's not going to happen in the present political situation. So what can Israel do? What they've done, unfortunately, the way the global media and reaction is that the brief sympathy that Israel had was all lost with the bombing in Gaza. There's no way around that. They've lost it. There's a net, except for the U.S. There's not a single country in the world that is supporting Israel right now in this continuing campaign. I don't know what else they could have done, because they had demographically, and when you consider the percentage of the Israeli population that was killed in this attack, it's pretty high. What do you do? I don't know.
I would add there's certain things that I do not believe in. Leprechauns, Elvis is dead. There's no alligators in New York City, and there was no brief sympathy for Israel. There were people condemning Israel and celebrating the attack by Hamas from the very beginning. And so I don't know, Art. Anything you can add to this question? The question, of course, is, let's just put it in the form. Is there any possible defense of the October 7th attack? Could any reasonable person say it's justified?
Well, I think an attack, no. I mean, the attack itself of a state versus state is, you can see, but when you know, you're quite right. The victims that they targeted, the extremes of the violence, I don't think it's unusual. I was just showing my class in the evening. We were going through a 50-year-old text by Frantz Fanon on The Wretched of the Earth, where he's trying to explain why the Algerians are slaughtering the French, the brutalities of decolonization, why innocent people are murdered in mass, and there's such extreme violence, which goes back decades. So I don't think it's surprising that these young, angry, unemployed men with no futures and no hope, bred with hatred, are going to kill anybody that they want. I think that's this. If I remember reading what the papers they found on the dead bodies of the Hamas guerrillas were either to kill everybody you can or capture or kidnap them. Right.
Right.
There's no distinction between man, women, and children, innocents, military. Just
Right,
kill everybody.
but whether it's surprising or not, I agree with you. It's not surprising. The question, again, is that there clearly is a faction in the United States and Europe which claims that resistance, by all means, is justified. And the question is, could this possibly be...
Art's going to jump out to this. Can I just say one thing about my own background and this own interest? What I think happened, and this is just what I'm thinking about, is that Israel did have people's sympathy generally in the West from about when its foundation in 1948, founded by sort of East European socialists to a certain degree, and Israel was seen as this agricultural commune, a secular agricultural commune in the Middle East, surrounded by hostile Arab tribes. Then they had a source of sympathy, plus you had the Holocaust prior to that. And everything changed for Israel in 1967. Israel was suddenly seen. That's where you have the concerted global campaign by people generally on the left, but others, to see Israel now as representing a powerful state, oppressing Arabs, dispossessing them of the land, and also allied with global capitalism. And oddly enough, the recent trends of major Wall Street firms attacking people who support Palestine fits into this anti-Semitic dialogue, because they're basically saying, well, look at the Jewish firms that are somehow still, so it's part of this global capitalism at its worst. Israel is a powerful state. They've dispossessed. So Israel, 67 was the dividing line. And 67 is also when Israel and other countries started to pursue Holocaust education far more aggressively, documented, because that was a way to sort of show what the history of Israel was like, the history of Jews, to people who wanted to denigrate it to a degree. But 67, and then 73 was even worse, because 73 was, Israel was caught off guard, the 73 Yom Kippur War, but that's when solutions to the Sinai became pressing, and Israel started to get more pressure by the West. Israel contemplated using nuclear weapons in 1973. Moshe Dayan, and that's how desperate the situation was in Israel in 1973. Although Kissinger would not allow it. Kissinger was actually, when he arrived in Israel in 1973, he was greeted by thousands of religious Jews who screamed "Jew boy" at him. Saw him as somebody who was willing to sell out Israel to other places. Kissinger was demonized as too liberal, if you can believe it or not.
Oh, I certainly, I remember a cartoon in that era that there's a Bible verse says, "If I forget the O Jerusalem, let my right hand lose its cunning." And the picture has him with his hand out, and he's chopping.
He was not sympathetic to. He was sympathetic to American interests because he was American Secretary of State. He wasn't. Anyway, Art, you take over.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I'm going to agree with you on the perception, but that's not the reality. And that, I think, is a battle that Israel has to fight here. I mean, constantly, Israel is the occupier, and the people of Gaza are refugees. Well, they're a mighty strange sort of refugee. And people keep pointing out, these are the only people that have refugee status inherited from generation to generation to generation. And got to go back, as I said a couple of weeks ago when I did the presentation for John's class. This goes back, really, it goes back even earlier than this, but you got to go back to World War I and the idiot treaties that ended World War I. And then, what happened? Well, the British, in their mandated territory, made two contradictory sets of promises. They made certain promises to the Arabs that they did not keep after World War I. The Arabs fought with them against the the Ottomans, and they were promised an Arab state, which they did not get, but they also made, at the same time in World War I, promises to the Jews. Now, the British partly kept their promises to the Arabs of that area in 46 when they created allowed the creation of Jordan, a substantial portion of the British man. And this, I think, is something that Israel needs to get across to people more often, is that of that Palestinian mandate, a huge portion of that went to the Arabs right away, even before the creation of Israel. Then the Israelis did not fight a war to occupy Arab territory. They fought a war of independence against Britain, and then the Arabs attacked. So they fight two simultaneous wars. But all of a sudden, we have a bad understanding of this situation. You had Jews living in all sorts of Muslim countries. Those Jews, about 1 million of them, left various Muslim countries and came to settle in Israel. There should have been, at that point, an exchange of populations. The Arab population, they were not Palestinians. Nobody called them Palestinians. They were just Arabs. It was the failure of the Arabs to accept the United Nations partition. The United Nations had agreed on an area that would be Jewish. Jews said, fine, even if it's tiny, we'll take that. The Arabs said, no. Okay, so you get, well, refugees. Yeah, I guess so, because they left. But again, there should have been exchange of population. And what Israel has to do, I think, a better job of it is saying, look, these Palestinians are not a separate ethnic people. Now, they were created as a separate people to give the Arabs a cause for making war against Israel. And this is, keep them in the refugee camps. Now, you point to 67 as the turning point. But look, before 67, where are these Palestinians? Well, they're in refugee camps. Where?
Yeah.
In the West Bank or in Gaza, but refugee camps controlled by other Muslim Arabs.
But let me say one thing about the only thing that I'll talk about as a rebuttal to one aspect is the invented nationalism. Every country modern Israel was an invented nation.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
So when people respond that these people aren't Palestinians, they are now, just like Americans are not now. You know, none of the founding fathers of the U.S., they were all English subjects. Suddenly they invent themselves as Americans. Who are the? And there's actually a very famous document. What is an American? Because it's an invented thing. It doesn't exist. Who are these people to call themselves American? They're just British colonists who've broken from the. So the Palestinians, they are now Palestinians. They may not have been originally, but now they're Palestinians.
But it does make this difference that if you acknowledge that Palestinians are a created people like everybody else, and the question becomes, when are they created? And if it's fairly recently, then the claim that they have some kind of age-old claim to this land is clearly much weaker. The Jews have been there, as Paul Johnson put it in his book on the Jews, 4,000 years ago. I mean, where are all the peoples that were there? And where are the Babylonians? Where are the Egyptians? Where are the Romans? But the Jews are still in Hebron. And that's one theory about why there's so much anti-Semitism worldwide. In places like Japan, where there are no Jews for all practical purposes, you get enormous numbers of anti-Semitic writings that are very popular. And when I was in China a couple of years ago, there were several Chinese students who spoke reasonably good English, and they just assumed that Jews controlled the United States. And when I told them it wasn't true, it was like I had an iron growing out of my head. Like I said, the sky is orange or something.
But one wonders how much of this anti-Israeli feelings back in the 60s and 70s by global, and you're right about the Japanese Red Army were anti-Semitic, these other groups, was because Israel became allied to so it was anti-Americanism that got sort of shifted into Israel as well. Because a lot of those groups, you would assume Vietnam War era, they're going to be against the United States. But Israel's relationship with the U.S., you wonder. So sometimes we say that people, hate the U.S. in the Middle East because of Israel, but it could be the reverse as well, which is people hate Israel because of the United States.
Oh yeah, well no, I think that's true for Iran. Israel is just the little Satan. Yeah. Where the big United States is the great Satan.
Yeah.
And for the left, in Europe and the United States, it's anti-Western civilization is the enemy, and clearly That's when they began to realize if the Israelis, if Israel had gone communist in 1960, the left would be all for it. I mean, the left would have been defending it all along. But it didn't. And it is clearly a Western state. Let me ask then another broad question. Is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? I feel like I should play the theme from Jeopardy.
I don't know. Art, you give me the. Let me give you.
All right, go ahead.
In the Hasidic community I lived in Montreal, most of those people, like Yaakov Rabkin, who was an historian at the University of Montreal, he was anti-Zionist, but they're Jews, religious Jews. They're anti-Zionist. How does that happen?
Because there is an idea in Chaim Potok's Chosen, it talks about this, that Danny can't talk to Reuven Malter. Why? Because Reuven's dad is in favor of the creation of Israel, and for the Hasidim, it's terrible. You cannot establish Israel. You're presumptive. Israel gets established when Messiah comes, and it's only in that book. It's only when when Israel becomes an established fact that they can mend their relationship. I wish I had my daughter Miranda here, who knows a little bit, but apparently my grandfather, who was a rabbi and a cantor, was on both sides of that issue. He was initially anti-Zionist and then became pro-Zionist or something like that. Miranda would know, but no. I mean, technically, no. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, because there are plenty of Jews that are anti-Zionist,
but
without being anti-Semitic.
That anti-Zionism is very different from the anti-Zionism that.
Well, the Soviets floated back in the day. They were the second country, maybe to recognize this Israel, that competed with the U.S. because they assumed it to be a socialist country, right? But later on, by '67, they started to promote heavily anti-Zionism. For the Soviets, it probably blended into anti-Semitism. So for that traditional type of those old school anti-Zionists, they were anti-Semitic, I think, And so, but you're right. The Jewish question is very different than the non-Jewish anti-Zionist.
Poor Israel has problems in again that part of the world. Much of the Muslim world was allied in World War I to Germany and Austria, and of course the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And then in World War II, again, much of it allied, much sympathy in the Muslim world with Hitler, and that's when you get all the protocols of the Elders of Zion and that strong anti-Nazi sentiment. But then, with Yasser Arafat in particular, the Soviets wanted influence in that part of the world, and so was So you get Israel is dealing with anti-Semitism that comes from the Nazis, but also dealing with a kind of an anti-capitalist policy that comes through the Soviet Union and its influence of that area. So Israel is. It's in a tough situation.
Managed to gather itself a remarkable collection of enemies.
Yeah.
It's hard to see long term how Israel can survive. Because people say it's survived so far. Yes, it has, but it's never faced the long-term demographic and geopolitical challenges. Never faced these types of challenges.
We might want to get back to the demographics in a moment, but I want to focus on this question a little bit longer, because it seems to me that left-wing anti-Zionism, as opposed to religious anti-Zionism among Jews, is almost inseparable from anti-Semitism. No, find me somebody on the American left who gives a rat's ass about Tibet and the colonization of Tibet by the Chinese, unless they're
Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, Noam Chomsky. Well, there's somebody, or Richard Gere, the actor.
Handfuls of people.
Handfuls
of people. Handfuls of people.
Old
school people.
And this was a classic example of colonization. You destroy the government, you move in lots of your own citizens, and now it's yours, and nobody's going to take it away from you. And the atrocities visited upon the Tibetan people, nobody cares about that.
No, they don't.
But they care deeply about Israel. And if you say that the Jews have no right to a homeland, why does this newly invented people, the Palestinians, have a right to some homeland? But that's the assumption, is they have a right to it, but the Jews don't. And I think that that's clearly anti-Semitism. Now, the original instinct may have been political for something else. But when you see, as we have seen, and this turns to the question of Western reactions to it, people marching and saying from the river to the sea, which means the extinction of Israel, and was originally a quite openly fascist, anti-Semitic, or by any means necessary, which clearly justifies the rape and murder of civilian women. If that's not anti-Semitism, what would you have to do?
I want to jump into that. Just give me
Sure.
and interrupt me along the way. But I think I see, like, let's just look at one aspect, like the Democratic Party, where you have the traditional old style economic sort of liberal. I'm not going to call them liberals, but sort of redistribution types. You know, for like, if you look at the Bidens and the Blinkens and the Clintons, they're pretty inflexibly pro-Israel. Hillary Clinton certainly was a staunch supporter of Israel. But you have a new group of people within the party, far more dynamic group than this group, who are social welfare Democrats, who really base their democratic allegiance not so much on economic issues or on these old style issues, which really was the heart of the Democratic Party, but on identity. And when you base your thing on identity, you're going to gravitate to those who you see as somehow oppressed. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what group they are, what gender they are, but if they're oppressed, your sympathy lies with them. It doesn't matter what their arguments are, what the cases. If they're oppressed, we're with them. And with the Palestinians, it's become they are the oppressed people. And we don't need to know anything about, we don't need to know anything about the Middle East. We don't know anything about Palestinian history. They're oppressed, and we're going to support them. And Israel is the oppressor. The Jews are wealthy, they're capitalists, they're successful. They are the oppressors. The Palestinians are the oppressed. That's all we need to know. And you're right. If you say that, if you think the Jews are wealthy and somehow brutal and all these other things, that is obviously, it's anti-Semitic in the sense that you're essentializing a people based on characteristics, right? That's anti-Semitism.
Sure, but the oppressed in the Horn of Africa don't attract.
But why?
your
Yeah,
attention.
Art.
Oppressed
Why
in
they've
Tibet.
selected this particular conflict? We were all in the 80s, and there was a brief surge of interest in the Sandinistas and people
Yes.
like that. But that was brief, right? And it went away very quickly. Nobody knows now what's happening in Nicaragua, right? East Timor was really only Noam Chomsky's. Noam Chomsky's deal was Indonesia slaughtering all the people in East Timor. But it was really the middle. I don't know. I don't know why the answer is. For
Well,
the
I mean,
obsession
isn't
with
it
Israel.
simply that? Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what confuses me is this. I understand, to a certain extent, what happens in the Islamic world. I think it was Bernard Lewis that wrote a book called What Went Wrong.
Yes.
And the Muslims, what is the evidence for the Muslim faith? Well, the evidence for the Muslim faith is Muslim success. And the more the Muslims conquer, the more true proof that is that religion is true. And all of a sudden, the Muslim faith is not. Everywhere, and something is fundamentally wrong. Very, very difficult from the Muslim point of view to give up an inch of territory, because everything you give up, and particularly Islam has a terrible problem with. It's sometimes hard to square Christian and Jewish religious tradition with modern thought. Almost impossible to square a Muslim tradition. And so there's this need to maintain every square inch of territory, and you cannot you can't give anything back. You can't give the tiniest sliver of the Holy Land back. And people have in the
That
Muslim
includes
world,
every believer, by the way. You can't give back any believer.
Right. And long memories. I mean, one of the things in the news today is in India, they're going to take a site of a mosque that was destroyed in the 1990s, and now they're going to build a temple to Rama on that. And this is just such an affront to the Muslims. Now, never mind the fact that the Muslims destroyed a Hindu temple to build their mosque on top of that. Never mind the fact that the Dome of the Rock is sitting on you cannot accept that direction. That I understand why there's such a deep psychological need to get rid of Israel to reclaim the Holy Land. What I don't understand is how that spills over so much into the American left. Now, you've
Yeah.
explained that oppressor ideology, and I think that's true, but then Ken asked the question is, okay, but why are we so little concerned about other people that are oppressed? It's very hard to figure.
Kashmir. I think that the people be marching about that either in favor of Pakistan or in favor of India, but nobody cares. The American left is. So I'm doubtful that it's. I agree with you that the oppressed is part of the leftist agenda and the way and the language they're going to use. But I mean, I suggested the one theory about the root of anti-Semitism is it tends to be strongest in nations like Japan and China that have had a hard time coming to grips with modernity and keeping their national identity alive. They're worried about losing their Japaneseness, their Chineseness, or their Germanness, and that's when the Jews become a very irritating fact because they've kept their culture alive for longer than probably anybody else we can think of. Whatever the roots of anti-Semitism may be, it's clearly a worldwide phenomenon. And what you see is the American left, I think, and to a much greater degree, the British left and some of the continental left in Europe. Once you start attacking Israel relentlessly, you just start thinking that way. Because we're used to hating Jews. They're used to despising Jews. And now all that passion comes back. And because it really is amazing how pervasive the anti-Israel sentiment has been in college campuses. We've seen attacks on Jews on some college campuses. And then, of course, the famous fireworks lately when 4 Ivy League presidents couldn't bring themselves to say the obvious things. That it's okay. Is it wrong by the standards of your university to call for the eradication of Jews? Well, it depends on the context.
Yeah, but the thing about those presidents is, poorly prepared for this presentation is that they were, but in a sense, they followed what Michael Kinsley once said. They made the mistake of telling the truth, which was it really isn't an issue in their universities.
Yes.
And but they just didn't articulate. We all know what the situation is in academia, how difficult it is to balance these various. And presidents aren't hired to be anything more than fundraisers at places like that, right? They're not involved in. And at a place like Harvard, she was quite right, which is that it's not against student policies to
call for the
this.
eradication
So she's
of Jews.
it's whether so in that sense we're not saying it's only about context, which
Right.
she is, but she just didn't have time to explain the fact that this is the state that universities are in.
Right, but we're talking
State
about
universities have reached that level.
we're talking about Harvard, one of the most famous universities in
Yeah.
the world, and they can't prep their president to come in
I know.
and talk about something like this. They can't give them some kind of warning ahead of time. I think part of the problem is simply that Claudine Gay, to take the most
Obvious
example, never talks to anybody who doesn't agree with her on anything.
No, exactly.
And when they suddenly are confronted by Republican senators, and they don't know what to say.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
And that's why we're better here at Northern than you are at Harvard, because we've got people on all sides.
We
of
do. We
everything.
keep Steve
It's,
around as our resident Bolshevik, and.
But I'll tell you, with the Israeli situation, though, you look at and what how did Israel get to this situation? Like, could they have solved some of these issues with a different internal political situation in Israel? Like, for example, Netanyahu's got an enormous amount of blame. Well, whether he's responsible or not, he's in charge. So he has to bear the responsibility. So
I think that's fair.
So, but could they have reached a point where a different type of government, a labor government, could have made deals with did Netanyahu feed into this mess himself by promoting one group against the other, dividing the nation politically?
Yeah, but when
he's a smart politician. I'm not, his role was to stay in power, and he did it.
Yeah, but it's hard to, as we've already agreed, Hamas slaughtered the most sympathetic Jews,
Exactly.
the people who were most likely to favor a two-state
Yeah.
solution, most likely to think the Palestinians were in fact being suppressed. The idea that there's some kind of government of Israel that was more friendly or more accommodating could make peace.
With them,
No reasonable person can believe
Yeah,
that now.
yeah.
And the people, I mean, the American government, I understand, is calling for a two-state solution. We'd had a two-state solution. Hamas was, for all practical purposes, an independent country. Granted, Israel had exercised power over the authority, over the territory that would be unusual in any other situation, but for obvious reasons. Nonetheless, Hamas controlled that territory for all practical purposes as an independent government. And what did they do? I mean, can you imagine what you could do with the West Bank if you didn't care about politics? They've got great beaches.
Yeah.
I mean, you could build hotels there. You could
mean
legalize.
Gaza?
Huh?
Gaza. You
Gaza.
said West
I meant.
Bank. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I didn't mean West Bank. Gaza. Yeah. I mean, it would be a great. If West Bank gets beaches, then things have gone really south. But that's the river to the sea.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I mean, what they could have done with that spot, but there's no aptitude or even desire to make the life better there. As far as we can tell, the only passion they have is to kill Jews.
Well, wait a minute now. The population of Gaza has grown from about 50 or 60,000 to 2 million. So,
they're not starving.
all right.
Okay, no, I mean but of course that's part of it, and I think the UN refugee policies have had a lot of effect on this, because it basically means that you don't have to work. You can sit around and talk treason all day long, talk revolution all day long, and you don't have to go to work.
And part of it is that Hamas is only going to be strengthened after this attack, obviously, right?
Well, that's hard to say.
Because I mean, like a question would be that somebody, and this is just one analyst, but I'm just thinking, for 30 some years now, Hamas was what, late 1980s, early 90s, sort of formulated. They've killed the leaders, the spiritual leaders. They've killed thousands of commanders, not just command like level. They've killed the bankers who funded Hamas. They've killed their foreign dignitaries, who, whatever diplomats they have. So they've killed in leadership after leadership after leadership of Hamas, decade after decade after decade, and it's only grown stronger. Because the argument that the CIA made was, you can't kill an idea. You can destabilize Hamas, but you're not going to destroy it. As he pointed out, he was involved in the original hunt for bin Laden. When everybody criticized him, his response was, well, he's hiding. It's going to take a while. But Al-Qaeda is still around decades later. They haven't been destroyed. You can kill the leaders, you can kill the bankers, you can kill his key supporters, but the idea remains. And that's the same with Hamas. How can they win it? How can they possibly defeat Hamas?
I think that I'll give you two answers to that. There's a book called the Great Brain about Catholic kids growing up in Utah, and in this family, the Catholic kids have trouble fighting against the Mormon kids who outnumber them, and then the oldest brother, Svein, he's able to beat up every Mormon kid his age, and Tom is able to beat up every Mormon kid his age, and then JD, the youngest, he's able to beat up every, and he says there's nothing so tolerant as a kid who knows you can beat him up. And this is partly, you wouldn't have thought that Israel was ever going to have peace with Egypt. You really never thought so. You never thought Egypt was going to Israel was going to have peace with Jordan, but they held on, and they eventually did win. Now, why not Gaza? And I'm not going to disagree with any of that. Why? Because the source is not Gaza. I think that the source is Iran. And if there is any solution for Israel, and I'm hopeful that there will be, it has to be a solution that stops Iran. Now, I think, I don't know, and maybe you have better evidence than I do. I think there is still in Iran enough sentiment that does not like the Ayatollahs, that does not like religious government, and I think ultimately what may happen is if the Iranians drift away from the current government, then that takes away a major source of funding and a major source of those ideas. If it is, and I don't know if you agree or not, but if it is really Iran that is the source of this, then the problem cannot be dealt with in Gaza. It's got to be dealt with in Iran.
Yeah, but that's why if I was Netanyahu, putting myself in this, if I ever had the intelligence that Iran was connected, I would bury it. I would destroy it. Because the last thing I would want to do in Israel situation is to have evidence that Iran planned an attack on Israel, requiring a response against Iran, which would lead to extraordinarily unpredictable consequences.
Unless you could build a region-wide alliance against Iran, which is not inconceivable. I wish to contradict at least one thing. It's obviously wrong that you can't kill an idea. The United States killed the ideas in Mein Kampf when we killed Hitler, effectively, and the Third Reich. We killed Japanese expansionism and imperialism when we dropped the atomic bombs. It's not impossible. It's difficult in some cases. It may be that the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank have gotten so their identity now is so inseparable from the desire to kill Israel that there's no solution to the problem as long as those people remain. Israel's not going to wipe them out, those peoples. And the best it can do, I mean, it's like having cancer. Yeah, it'd be great if you get rid of the cancer, but if you can't, at least knock it down with whatever mean you have.
Somehow.
And when it comes back, you do it again.
Yeah.
And that might be the only thing. I just don't see any possibility, although I think Art's completely right. The problem is not hatred from Hamas and Hezbollah and these other groups. The problem is how much power they have. Ordinarily, on their own, they have none. There's nothing they can send a bomber in every now and then, but Israel's gotten pretty good at that. So there's nothing much they can do without outside help, like from Iran. Now, so the solution would be for a number of powers in the Middle East, Muslim powers, to recognize that the biggest threat to their existence and peace is Iran. If you could somehow form a coalition against Iran that was effective, and I think Art is clearly right. I think a majority of people in Iran do not sympathize, but it doesn't matter because the Ayatollahs have the security forces, and they're
willing to kill people.
They're willing to kill whoever they have to keep power and to exercise. And these are true believers. I mean, they think the world is coming to an end. They're trying to hasten the process. As a consequence, there are no ordinary ways to moderate their behavior. So you have to make it impossible for them to do anything. But I think our State Department for a long time reflexively wants to try and solve every problem by talking about it. Sometimes you can't do that.
But we're also wondering, like, are we entering a period where it's harder to sell the American public on a protracted involvement in the Middle East? In the past, you didn't really have to sell it, right? But now I'm seeing sort of more, and it's not just from the left, but people who simply are exhausted with expenditures on foreign aid.
And when having to read about it every day. I mean, it really is it's just no fun. Afghanistan was no fun to be hearing about all the time. But right now I'm teaching modern political philosophy, and we're reading Machiavelli. And Machiavelli would have some things to say about this. He would say either leave Afghanistan alone or kill it. And by kill it, he would mean carpet bombing Kabul. Destroy everything. Don't worry.
Which is what the Soviets tried to do before the U.S. intervened and prevented. It would have been what it would have been was a Central Asian style East European kleptocracy, and instead we turned it into a Islamic terrorist base. So I'm not sure, unintended consequences.
Thank you, Jimmy Carter.
American policy in the middle. What was it? The elder Assad once said, the hard thing about negotiating with Americans is you never know when they're going to stab themselves in the back.
Exactly.
And I think he's absolutely, we haven't had coherent policy in a long time, but a big part of it is this idea that down deep, we all want to get along. We don't really want to hurt each other.
And we're all the same.
That's and we're all problem. The same. And the truth of the matter is, it just isn't the case. If, the Soviets, I suspect in an earlier period, the Soviets would have been able to handle Afghanistan. I think by the time the Soviet-Afghan occupation happens,
They were falling apart.
they were falling
too.
apart. There simply wasn't the strength anymore. We had a student here who was a prisoner of the Afghans from Russia, and his stories about that were interesting. But they didn't have the power anymore.
But you see even today where the mixed signals, let's just say that, as a State Department official, you have to talk about human rights. That's just the way it is. It's just part of you, the way you're politically forced to talk about it. So you'll have them telling that Israel they support Israeli attacks, Israeli reactions in Gaza, as long as they follow human rights regulations. How does that possibly work?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. So they're allowed to attempt to degrade Hamas in Gaza, but not kill anybody except the actual commanders of the Hamas.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just.
This is it's not clear that there's any kind of, certainly not any beautiful solution, and maybe not any solution at all. And I think whether Israel survives in the long run, the question is going to be demographic. Right? France can survive with a drop in birth rates for quite a while. Japan can survive for quite a while with the drop of birth rates we're seeing in modern developed countries. Israel can't, and we're seeing it there. And that's I think the biggest problem. But it does seem to me that the most disturbing aspect of the whole thing is how much the by any means necessary approach, basically the affirmation of genocidal war crimes, has taken root in American universities and in European universities. It's deep. I don't think it's a majority in any of these places, but it's the kind of minority that, like the Bolsheviks, it didn't matter, because they know exactly what they want to do and they're willing to do anything to achieve it. And that a few decades ago, you wouldn't have seen this. The reaction might have been there under the surface, but people wouldn't have come out and cheered on the rape and murder of women. The National Organization for Women would not have been silent about the rape of women as a war crime. The UN Women would not have taken 55 days to say something about this. At least I don't think that's true. Maybe it is, and maybe the left has been more corrupt for longer than I think it has. But it's corrupt now.
But part of it, I do think that it still comes back to the shift on the left has been, there's not any sort of coherent left in the sense of organizational. One might say things like the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest group. That's the old Angela Davis, started with, whatever groups in the 60s and 70s. They have about 900,000 members. They came out almost immediately, October 7th, supporting the Palestinian issue, right? Lost quite a few members, I think, based on some members on that. But I think part of it has to be seen as the identity side of it, which is that they perceive the world in very binary terms of victim and oppressor, and there's no gray in this kind of vision. And the Palestinians are the victims, and the Jews, American Jews, which I know how many really have any true understanding of what Israel is like, the complexity. Israel is a complex society, split, but they're looking at wealthy American Jews, and it's a combination of jealousy, or it's hatred toward the rich, resentments, humiliation, all these types of things that feed into, so they dislike American Jews, they dislike Israel. And
it's like white people who will not grovel to the identity.
Exactly. And I think it's you're right. It's poisonous in many ways, but it's so much a part of how people identify themselves, right?
Well, there are actually a couple of books out. I was reading a review today in I think the Washington Post, but about a couple of books that have taken the progressives or the woke part of the left to task, because I don't think that part of the left has any principle other than power. It's, basically how many fingers am I holding up? If you say 4 rats are going to chew off your face. If you say 5, you're a member of the party.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, again, this is when Claudine Gay talks about freedom of speech in front of the Senate committee. This Harvard is a place where they fired Larry Summers as their president because he dared to suggest that there's a biological difference between the way men and women think. She herself was part of a bunch of folks that hounded out one of the scholars at Harvard because she thought biological sex is real. What matters is what the party says, what the progressives say.
And I think there's an enormous amount of ignorance about the history behind these kinds of conflicts.
Sure.
I mean, they get their information based on whatever Instagram posts or about dead bodies. They really do. It's really not much deeper than that, the knowledge base for a lot
As
of
my previous remark about TikTok and my students.
So they
from
get
Africa.
this information about dead bodies in Gaza. They pick up all kinds of conspiracy theories, which have, like most conspiracy theories, have no value whatsoever. And they can even deny the existence of this original attack. I've heard people. I remember going once to the Soviet Republic of Georgia, where a person who used to be the culture minister of the country sat down with me and explained to me how September 11th was a concoction of the CIA. And with a straight face, started to talk about the September 11th. And so when you get this kind of conspiracy mixed with ignorance, mixed with resentment, humiliation, you're going to get these. And that's part of what drove Hitler. We'll talk about that. So much of the anti-Semitism in the 30s was not coherent, was it? No. Some of it was fear of. Some of it was some of it was fear of Bolshevism. Some of it was old-style hatred of Jews as being different. Some of it was economic control, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So you get the same weird mix here. But I think if you picked a different issue, you could almost check the boxes. How do you feel about gender? Well, here you go. How do you feel about race? How do you feel about crime? So you check the same boxes on every. It's predictable, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the unfortunate thing. And you're never going to persuade them differently. If you think logical argumentation works, it doesn't.
Somebody, it might have been Christopher Hitchens, said you can't reason somebody out of a position they weren't reasoned into.
Too bad he died. He would have been a great voice.
Christopher Hitchens, he was my favorite atheist, and by far and away one of my favorite political commentators. Yeah. A little nuts about certain topics, but
at the end he did become a little bit like with a little bit too pro torture at the very end.
But anyway,
but a bright mind.
Christopher Hitchens is probably off topic.
Yeah.
Art, do you have anything you want to round out to close the discussion of?
No, I love having discussions at Northern, but I'm still perplexed. Tom Lehrer had that old song, National Brotherhood Week.
Yes. Reach out and take the hand of someone you can't stand.
Yeah, but, Protestants hate the Catholics, Catholics hate the Protestants, Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews. And he got a huge laugh line with that in 1964, I think. And it's still just, I still cannot figure this out. Why? I mean, we talked about a lot of things, but that core of anti-Semitism that's there on the left, that's there on the right, that you're telling me is in Japan and China and everywhere else. I like your explanation there.
That's the only one I've ever heard that's coherent. But, yeah.
I'll give you another one.
Okay.
Jews think they're better.
Okay.
They're God's chosen people.
Well, yeah, I mean,
no. I at the presentation I did, one of the women in the audience suggested that the whole thing is, really there's a spiritual force underneath, and that is also very coherent. That really there is an underlying spiritual battle here going on.
The interesting thing about many of these dissenting voices is that whatever your positions on Israel itself is driven by debates on the same things we're talking about. There's not a lot of debates in Iran on these types of things, but Israel and the American Jewish community is deeply split on these same issues. So you will see a lot of plurality in these and democracy in these.
And I want to emphasize, in saying that I think in the United States and Europe, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are usually the same thing. I don't mean that one can't criticize Israel or that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. That's a completely different issue.
Yeah.
I think someone can certainly, a reasonable person can certainly disagree with Israel's policy, with what they're doing in the West Bank and that sort of thing. I would point out that it's impossible to imagine any other government in the region trying as hard as the IDF does, the Israeli Defense Force, to avoid civilian casualties. In fact, they wouldn't try at all. And of course, we've seen Hamas actually targeted civilians. But that doesn't mean you can't criticize Israel's policy. But I still think that for the most part, anti-Zion, what's called anti-Zionism in the West is inseparable.
It wasn't always, but it has become like that.
Well, I think we've probably hammered this one well enough. We have a, as I recall, this is the first time I've emceed the TV show, and we have a email address, spotlight@northern.edu. I think that's our email address, and you can certainly send us a message there. We're hopefully going to rip the audio version of this and put it on the Wolf Tracks podcast, and I strongly recommend that podcast. I interview members of my other faculty on all kinds of questions. We've done shows on Christmas movies, Halloween movies. We need to give Satan his due as well, and lots of scientific, literary questions, poetry, church clowns. If you've never heard of church clowns, I did an interview.
We did go to that. Art had a noon forum on church clowns at one point.
I didn't. Oh yeah. So Liz Sills I had never heard of it.
I'd never heard of it before either.
I had never heard of church clowns. This is great. But if you want to know what they are, go to Wolf Tracks, look it up, and hopefully you'll be seeing more of us on Northern TV in upcoming days. Thank you for watching. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. And that's all for Spotlight today.
Thank you.